Hello everyone, welcome to a dialogue between Chinese and English classics. I'm Professor 9 from the College of Foreign Studies of Jinan University.
And I am James, a guest teacher at the College of Foreign Studies of Jinan University.
In this unit, we explore Gary Slider and the Cold Mountain Poems, which contains the following three parts. Part 1, Gary Slider and Cold Mountain Poems. Part 2, Gary Slider's translation of Cold Mountain poetry. Part 3, Zen Buddhism and Slider's poetic creation. James, would you please introduce Gary Slider to us?
My pleasure, Professor Pu. Gary Slider was born in 1930. He is an American poet, essayist, translator, believer of Zen Buddhism, environmentalist, and one of the representatives of the Beat generation in the 20th century. Slider was born in San Francisco and worked on his parents' farms in Washington State and Oregon in the northwestern United States in his early years. He graduated from Reed College with a degree in literature and anthropology in 1951.
Then what is Gary Slider best known for?
Perhaps he is best known as a poet. His early work has been associated with the Beat generation and the San Francisco Renaissance. In 1975, he won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. In 2003, Slider was elected as Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets.
Yes, as I know, he has published 16 volumes of poetry collections, among which The Turtle Island won the 1975 Pulitzer Prize. Rip Rap and the Cold Mountain Poems, Myths and the Texts, The Back Country, Axe Handles, No Nature, New and Selected Poems, and The Mountains and Rivers Without End are also among his poetic creations.
Exactly. Speaking of Rip Rap and Cold Mountain Poems, we have to go back to Slider's relationship with Oriental culture. Professor Pu, could you explain it for us?
Of course. You know, Slider studied Oriental languages at the University of California at Berkeley, during which he participated in the Beat poetry activities. At the same time, the English translations of Cold Mountain Poems also had a great influence on him, which led to his voyage to Japan, where he spent 3 years in an ashram as a monk, devoting himself to the strenuous Zen study. In 1969, Slider returned to America with his Japanese wife and settled in the Los Sierra Nevada Mountains, California, where they led a very simple life. In 1984, Slider and Allen Ginsberg visited China as members of the delegation of American writers. With this, his dream to visit the Middle Kingdom for 30 years came true. Slider once mentioned that Chinese culture and literature exerted an influence of 80% on him in the 1950s and 1960s. Since 1985, Slider has been a professor of English at the University of California at Davis, and he continued to travel and read extensively, delivered lectures, and engaged in environmental protection.
Wow, what a legend! Oriental culture must have a significant influence on Slider's poems and his life as well.
That's right. Slider once made the following statement: "My poetic work has been influenced by diverse cultures and literatures, like Scotch-English traditional ballads and folk songs, William Blake, classical Chinese poetry, Walter Whitman, Robinson Jeffers, Ezra Pound, Native American songs and poems, haiku, Noh drama, Zen sayings, and much more. The influence from haiku and from the Chinese is, I think, the deepest." How about we read Slider's haiku together?
That would be wonderful. Let me read this one. Ravens in the afternoon control, burn smoky haze, croaking away. Coyotes yipping in the starry early dawn.
The description is so delicate. The poem is a direct demonstration of two natural scenes, where no human interference seems to be found. It reflects the haiku sensitivity of being egoless, and it is in accordance with the Zen traditions.
I'm so interested in haiku. Professor Pu, could you tell us something more about it?
That would give me a great pleasure. The haiku is a short Japanese poem that is both very easy and extremely difficult to do. They have a set of rules and guidelines which are not followed slavishly. It is hard to appreciate haiku fully in translation because much of their power is in the trickstone with the syntax. Although the greatest haiku are among the finest utterances in the world, the huge number of lesser haiku play a valuable and enlivening role in the culture. In Slider's words, non-Japanese societies can learn from this tradition and feel free to write brief poems that are strong, news of the day, news of the moment, and fundamentally without ego.
It is novel. I love this poem and cannot agree more with your interpretation. Now, I propose we read some other haikus by Snyder together.
Yes, let me read this one. They didn't hire him, so he ate his lunch alone. The loon whistle. The first two lines depict a normal situation in life, but the third line makes the whole poem ambiguous. The loon whistle, as an image, could be the representation of his feelings about the situation. However, whether he was happy or frustrated about the situation is to be decided by the readers.
That's a wonderful interpretation. And let me try this one. A truck went by 3 hours ago. Smoke Creek Desert. It reminds me of a trip through the vast inner land of the United States, or traveling to Tibet. The truck creaks through the desert, leaving smoke behind.
But to overlap the images is an important technique Slider has learned from Oriental poetry, including haikus and classical Chinese poems, of which the most significant is the Cold Mountain poems.
Professor Pu, then what is the relationship between Snyder and Cold Mountain? Why Cold Mountain?
Very good questions. Speaking of the Cold Mountain, we first have to know one great person named Han San in Chinese history.
Who is Han Shan? I can't wait to know more about Han Shan.
Well, Han San is a Chinese pinyin of Cold Mountain, who is associated with a collection of poems from the Tang Dynasty in the Taoist and Zen tradition. No one knows who he was, when he lived and when he died, nor whether he actually existed or not. In Japanese and in Chinese paintings, Han San is often depicted together with Si De or with Feng Gan, a larger monk with legendary attributes. Little is known of his work, since he was a recluse living in a remote region, and his poems were written on rocks in the mountains that he called homes. Of the 600 poems he is thought to have written at some point before his death, 313 were collected and have survived. Among the 57 poems attributed to Han San's friend, Si De, 7 appeared to be authored by Han San. So, the total number of Han San poems amounts to 320. Han San's poetry consists of Chinese verse in 3, 5, or 7 character lines. The whole poem is never shorter than 4 lines and never longer than 34 lines. The language is marked by the use of more colloquial language than that of other Tang poems. Generally speaking, Han San poems fall into 3 categories. Firstly, the biographical poems about his life before he arrived at Cold Mountain. Secondly, the religious and political poems, generally critical of conventional wisdom and those who embrace it. And thirdly, the transcendental poems, about his sojourn at Cold Mountain. They are notable for their straightforwardness, which contrasts sharply with the cleverness and the intricacies that marked typical Tang Dynasty poetry. Let's appreciate one of his poems with 8 5-character lines. The Chinese reads, 人问寒山道，寒山路不通，夏天冰未释，日出雾朦胧。似我何由介，与今心不同。君心若是我，还得到其中。James, could you read the translation for us?
Of course. The English reads, Men asked the way to Cold Mountain. Cold Mountain. There's no through trail. In summer, ice doesn't melt. The rising sun blurs in swirling fog. How did I make it? My heart's not the same as yours. If your heart was like mine, you'd get it and be right here. I got it! The Cold Mountain is not only the English name of Hanshan, but also the place he lived and the image in his poems. I would like to visit the Cold Mountain and caves in the future. Professor Pu, may I ask you another question? What is the relationship between Hanshan and Snyder?
A good question again. We have gradually come to the point. Let's talk about it next time, because we have already reached the end of this part. Thank you for your watching.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.